Morning, everyone. There's one person here. Good morning. All right. Did you know that throughout history, there have been trials that have occurred that have done several different things that have captivated our attention, that have modified culture, and some trials have even changed history. We have trials such as the O.J. Simpson trial, which really captivated our attention. I remember some time ago when this trial actually occurred, being pinned to my television, watching O.J. and his friend drive in a white Bronco down the expressway for hours. Captivated the world. And as that trial went on, people around the world, not just in the United States, around the world, wanted to watch. The same thing or a similar thing happened even with the Watergate trials. Even though you didn't have multimedia and television and cable the way we had it now, when the whole Richard Nixon situation occurred, people were captivated. That was a trial that captivated the world. There are other trials that have happened that have modified culture. The trial of Roe versus Wade, the critical trial on abortion rights, whether there's an aspect of the right to choose to abort a child or a child has life even in the mother's womb. That trial and the results of that trial modified culture because beforehand it was obvious and apparent to everyone for the most part that a baby, even inside the womb, is a baby. However, after this, that began to shift, changed culture, because all of a sudden, a baby inside the womb is not a baby. It's a part of the mother's body. Another trial was like the Bill Clinton impeachment trial. It was a question as to whether politicians have a moral obligation to act upstandingly. It changed culture because as a result of that trial, we begin to think of, well, politicians, they're just public servants, but they're human like us and they made a mistake. So it changed our mind state from our expectation of a president being perfect and upstanding to he's just a flawed man. Then there are trials that have changed history. Ones like the Dred Scott case that happened even here in St. Louis. The aspect of a man who had traveled outside of Missouri into non-slave states and worked there for an extended period of time with his master, but came back and then went to court and said, I've spent such a significant period of time in non-slave states, I believe that I should be set free. And the Supreme Court's judgment on this was that, no, you are technically not a citizen, so you can't really even sue in court. You're not capable of that. This changed history because it was one of the motivations for Abraham Lincoln and his staff and to begin the whole Emancipation Proclamation and set off the Civil War. Brown versus the Board of Education is another one of those trials that changed history. Before then, there was no integrated schools. The idea of separate but equal was an obvious truth. But after that, it was not. And even ramifications of that today are being seen, obviously, with diverse schools. But in St. Louis, and this I just heard from a student, there's a concept, or there's this program called DSEG, where they're still busing mostly minority kids from the inner city to suburban school districts to continue the integration of the school system. That I didn't recognize was still happening in other states. Again, only being here almost a year now, I didn't recognize that. But obviously a trial like Brown versus the Board of Education still has a significant impact. Now these cases and many more have, like I said, captivated our hearts and our minds, captivated the attention of the world and the nation. They've modified our culture, and even more, they've changed history. But there is only one trial that has ever happened throughout history that has done all three. That not only captivated our hearts, that captured us, that not only changed culture, but changed the way we think about the world, and even more, changed history. And that was the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. If you're just joining us for the first time this week, we are in a series called 24, where we're chronicling the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. Last week, we talked about the Last Supper and the significance of the 4 glasses of wine, or the 4 cups of wine that he presented to his disciples at that time. The third being the cup of redemption, in which he said, "This is my blood." And understanding how significant that was, how significant it was throughout history and the foretelling of the events that we're talking about today, and we'll be talking about all the way leading up to Easter. Now today we're going to talk about the next portion, which were the trials of Jesus. Now the trials were in our mind, and as we even read it through the scriptures, we understand that it was terrifying, but what I would like to do today is to take a little bit more of a historic perspective. We're going to do things a little differently. I want to really dig deep into the historicity. I think I may have even made that word up. But you got permission to do that when you have the mic. The historical facts of the trials of Jesus. See, one thing I want you to walk away with today, and if it's really even the only thing that you walk away with today, is recognizing that this really happened. It's not just a story that is written in the Bible, a fairy tale that happened and has a fairy tale ending. These were significant events of real people. It's not only chronicled throughout the Bible, but in Roman texts, they talk about these trials, as well as a Jewish scholar named Josephus actually wrote about it. And what's significant about that is that he's a Jewish scholar, so he was not a Christian. He was not on the side of Jesus. He was not one of his followers. He was simply a Jewish scholar who was writing down what occurred. And it lines up with the Gospels. So this was something that occurred. Now, in order for us to take a historic perspective, we need to know the significant things or the context of the time. Now, what you need to know is Jerusalem at that time was actually under the control of Rome. We have a map of that. Rome, obviously, is in Italy. Jerusalem, way across the Mediterranean Sea, it's about 1,200 nautical miles. So Rome had conquered just about every part of Western Europe at this point in time. Everybody has heard about the Roman Empire, and it was great. It was vast. They were the most powerful army, as history would tell it, all the way up into the army of the United States today. Rome was the baddest empire there ever was. Now, Rome had control of Jerusalem, and this was the time of Julius Caesar, and even after his death, unfortunate death, some people would say, Octavius and so forth. This was all around that time. But Caesar was very frustrated with Jerusalem and that whole area, because Jerusalem had this sect of people who, one, believed in one God, which was kind of harebrained. They were like, come on now. There was a plenty of gods back then. But these Jews believed in one God. Secondly, they kept on fighting because of their one God. They kept on causing uprisings. They kept on causing a headache for Caesar. Now, he's all the way over there, so what he does is he appoints a governor over Jerusalem. And because they continue having these cultural clashes, he also says, you know what, let them have a king as well. So there's a governor who's loyal to Caesar, who's over Jerusalem, and there's a king who really just is a puppet king, to be honest with you, but he handles really the religious and the cultural aspects of that time, because it was too difficult for Rome to try to figure out all the festivals, all the feasts, how do you behave, and things along those lines. But it was his job to handle all those issues. So Jerusalem continues to have uprising, and what's even more significant about some of those uprisings is that they occurred by people, many of them, by people who claim to be the Messiah. People who claim to be God on earth, the Savior of the Jewish people. Jesus was not the first person to walk through Jerusalem or go in there and say, God sent me. Now we need to take over our land. He was not the first by far. There was maybe a half a dozen others. And there were others who had gotten really far, but the only difference and the most significant difference between Jesus and these others is that they were causing uprisings and they were warlord type of uprisings. They would fight against the Romans, take up swords, and they would gather people to them and say, now we're going to storm the temple, now we're going to take over things. And each time, Rome, the biggest, baddest army there is at that time, would just squash them. And every time, Caesar would get more and more frustrated and put the tighter and tighter grasp on what goes on in Jerusalem, because these rabble-rousers, these crazy people who believe in this one God, keep causing him problems. And this was also, if you look at it, it's on the Mediterranean Sea, which was huge for trade and money. So basically, every time they have an uprising, they're messing with Caesar's pockets. And that's not a good thing to do for the leader of the greatest empire of all time. Now, there's some key players that I want to point out for this trial to occur. One, we have Jesus. Now, obviously, this is Jesus from the Passion of the Christ, so he looks more like an American Jesus, but he probably looked a lot more Middle Eastern, a lot more like what we would see as Middle Eastern people today. But you can't get distracted from that, because we're using, I think, one of the best depictions of the Passion of the Christ that we have. But Jesus, at that point in time, was considered, for some, a great teacher. For others, he was the Messiah. What he taught was truth and so real for them that they left mother, father, home, treasure, everything to follow him. He did miracles, feeding 4,000, 5,000 people, raising the dead, healing the sick, casting out demons. He did some spectacular things, and even in that time, before Facebook and Twitter, it got out, and it spread very quickly. Now, to others, he was a threat, and that brings us to Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas was the high priest at that point in time. Now, the high priest, to give you a perspective, the high priest would be considered kind of like the Pope is to the Catholic Church today. Only he is even more significant than the Pope. He rules basically the whole religious synagogue or church of that time. What he says goes. He is the only one allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, the most special place within the temple. He presides over all of the sacrifices, and he benefits from the temple tax and from everything that goes on. And he is essentially the religious leader of that time. So he has a great deal of influence, just like the Pope would today. If the Pope says, hey, we're going to go this way with our beliefs and our faith and how we're going to think, that's how people win. So his sway over the crowd and over the Jewish people of that time can't be undermined. However, with Jesus doing these miracles and talking and teaching in the synagogue, it is. Then you have his father-in-law, his name is Annas. Now, Annas was, like I said, his father-in-law. Annas was the past high priest. So before Caiaphas was the high priest, Annas was the high priest. So both of them have a lot to lose if this Jesus person, this rabble-rouser, comes around and starts causing trouble. He takes away from their influence in society. Next, you have Pontius Pilate. I said that Caesar put a governor over Jerusalem. That was Pontius Pilate. He basically was there to keep peace and make sure the trade continues to happen and to squash any issues that happened in Jerusalem. But there's one significant thing that you have to know about Pontius Pilate is that he's also deathly afraid of Caesar, as just about everybody is, because he's the most powerful man in the world. And Caesar has sent him there particularly because there's constantly problems. And basically he said to Pontius Pilate, if there are any more problems going on there, it's going to be your tail. I'm coming after you. So Pontius Pilate is not there just simply, sitting back on his high chair. His job is to keep control, no matter what, in Jerusalem. Lastly, the last character is Herod. Now Herod, he's the puppet king of the Jews. He's there to basically to keep everything, to let them have somebody to serve directly instead of feeling like they're serving Caesar directly. So he doesn't have a whole lot of power, but one thing that's really interesting, what key you need to know about Herod is he's the second Herod. The first Herod, Herod the Great, his father was, when we think about the whole Bible story, the birth of Jesus, you remember there was a King Herod who sent his army out to kill all of the firstborn babies or for the Jewish people because he heard there was the Messiah being born. That was Herod the first, Herod's father. This is Herod Antipas. He's his son, one of 4 sons, but he's one of his sons, and he's over Galilee area, which is where Jesus was born and so forth. So he's obviously heard the stories about what his father had taught him. His father was so worried about the Messiah coming some 30 years before that he wanted to wipe out all the male children in the Jerusalem of the Jewish people. He recognizes this, and now he hears some 30 years later about this Jesus, the Messiah person. So it's key that we understand what has happened in history. And all of those people I just pointed out, they're not just characters from the Bible. Again, they are documented through Roman texts, through Jewish texts, through other Near East texts. Talk about each one of those individuals. This really happened. Now, Jesus was going through and performing miracles. What happened that led to his trial? Like I said, he was performing miracles. He was basically claiming to be the Messiah, causing issues for the leadership of Caiaphas and Annas. And eventually, they got tired of it. They got tired of him breaking the Jewish laws, like walking too much on the Sabbath day or eating on the Sabbath day. Or they got tired of him preaching about how to spend your money and not just to give it away to the temple. They got tired of him going and telling them that they're doing things wrong by not feeding the poor and helping the sick. They were really frustrated with this teacher causing issues. So they conspired to get him captured. And once they captured him, they put him on trial. Basically, before a group of people called the Sanhedrin, which would have been like the Jewish Supreme Court. They take him there and they ask him a few key questions. And this is what it probably looked like. When we think of trials, we have in our mind the trials that we have in an American court, where the person who are being accused is innocent until proven guilty. And it's actually based on a Judeo-Christian principle where, according to the scriptures, we should believe that and we should behave that way. But according to the scriptures, and this movie actually depicts the book of John very well as far as his trial, Jesus was basically guilty until proven innocent or something other than it. But one thing that we have to recognize is not that he was taking the trial simply because Ananias and Caiaphas was losing, they were losing influence, they were losing money, they were losing all of the power that they had there. But at his own admission, they asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" And his answer, "I am." That's very significant. Obviously, because you have to think about the history that they've had in Jerusalem. They've had, like I said, maybe a half a dozen people who've shown up saying, I'm the Messiah. And each one of them has led an army against Rome and been slaughtered. So, to one extent, we have to recognize that they may simply be responding to what has happened in the past. We have a perception that the Jewish people of that time were just horrible people, but they may simply be saying, we've seen this, done that. All you're going to do is cause problems, and then Rome is going to come down on us even harder. But then there's the balance of that, and there's the spiritual. That when he says he's the Messiah, to say such a thing and to not be the Messiah is blasphemy. It would be like me telling you right now, I'm Jesus Christ. You think to yourself, no, he's not. You don't look nothing like Jesus. What miracles have you done? You'd ask for proof. And if I were to say that in the presence of a church with some really, really religious, deep religious people, they might throw stones at me. Not that they should, but because they're hooked into the laws and the rules and the ways of doing things, that saying something as crazy as, I'm the Lord Jesus Christ, would frustrate them, would make them angry. And that is essentially what happened there. But what's key, and really key, is that Jesus did not shy away from saying that he was the Messiah. Often in the world today, many people will say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. He never, so we don't, it's an argument for, well, it's Jesus, it could be Muhammad, or it could be Buddha, or it could be anything, because Jesus never claimed to be anything more than just a great teacher. That's not true. He clearly said, I'm God. I am the Son of Man. And as a result, that trial occurred and it moved forward. Now, from a historical perspective, this was the Jewish council. They wanted to kill him at that point in time, but again, they have no real power. The governor, Pontius Pilate, has all of the political influence. Only he can really convict somebody to death or to jail or to any of those things. So they can have a trial, but they can't really do anything about it outside of beat and abusing, which obviously is bad enough. It wouldn't be aligned with what their principles were, so they're definitely out of line. What the Bible would have said is definitely not to beat this person without a fair trial or without some proof. But they can't do anything further. So the next video we're going to see is them bringing him before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and understanding and recognizing that he really does have the influence. But keep in mind, Pontius Pilate is there under Caesar, and his job is to keep things calm, keep these people from having another uprising. Don't cause any ripples, and that'll help you understand his decision making. From that depiction, you could almost think that Pilate was a compassionate man, that he listened to Jesus, he asked him a question, and he wants to know what is truth. And according to the scriptures, that is in fact the conversation that they had, that Pilate wanted to really know who Jesus was. And Jesus takes this opportunity to witness to Pilate. But he also, once again, affirms that he is in fact the Son of God, that he is the Messiah. This captivates Pilate. But at the same time, the predicament that Pilate is in is a no-win situation. Pilate was not a nice guy. There's no question about that. To be a Roman governor, to rise to the level of leadership that he is in, he's probably had to do some pretty underhanded things. It's not too different than American politics. He may know where the bodies are buried. He's not a compassionate individual, but he has one task. He needs to keep the peace in Jerusalem. And if you see how Annas appeals to Pilate, he says, at first Caiaphas is saying, well, he's broken the Sabbath, he's broke this law, he's done that. Then Annas, the more older and wiser, says he refuses to pay taxes to the governor. And then Pilate's like, so he did break one of our laws. Because him breaking the Sabbath or teaching odd Jewish things is no concern for the Roman governor. But him not paying his taxes, that is a concern. But yet and still, Pilate doesn't really want to have anything to do with this because he's in a no-win situation. He could do as they say and punish this man, but like he said, he's the leader of some faction of people who may cause an uprising. So if he punishes Jesus, there may be an uprising. If he doesn't punish Jesus, then the Sanhedrin, these Jewish leaders, may cause an uprising. Pilate is in a lose-lose situation. And so he says, well, take him to Herod. Let Herod judge him. And I want to show you this video clip, particularly because understanding how Herod behaves and understanding how history has treated him is significant. And then we'll get to the point of really understanding what is the final thing that Pilate has to do in order for Jesus to go to the cross. The reason why I find that piece so interesting is, one, that you can kind of see the aspect of Herod being a puppet king. He doesn't really have any leadership. He's there, he has a lot of influence given to him by his father. But another thing is that you can see that he's really understood who Jesus was. He asks him, are you the one whose birth was foretold? Which lets you know that his father told him about what he did to the Jewish people at that time. His father let him know that there was going to be trouble coming along at some point in time. And Herod knew that. Now, Herod did have some power to do whatever he wanted within the Jewish realm. Herod had the power to execute Jesus. And that's really key for us to understand, because you see there, and the way the Bible really portrayed it, and again, like I said, the reason why I like this movie is because it really goes through the scriptures almost exactly. They don't ad-lib very much. If you read through John, they really take it almost word for word to some extent. Now, not with Herod parts. That's probably the only one where he adds where you do a few different miracles and so forth. But you notice that Jesus said nothing. Why did he not say anything? He had already told the leadership, yes, I'm the Messiah. He had answered Pontius Pilate, yes, it's as you said, I am the Son of Man, and my kingdom is not of this earth. He says it to them. Why not say it to Herod too? He's obviously not afraid of saying he's the Messiah. Well, because Herod does have the power to kill him. We know this because that Herod killed John the Baptist. Earlier on, John the Baptist was captured, well, not captured, he was just accosted by Herod. And Herod, on a whim at his daughter-in-law's celebration, her birthday celebration, I believe it was, he has to give her a gift. And she says, well, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter, to that Herod. And so he beheads John the Baptist. So Herod is not so much of a fool as he's portrayed there, and he's not just some whimsical guy who just wants to party all the time. He's a terror as well. But Jesus strategically does not say anything to him, because if he had said, yes, I'm the Messiah, then what would Herod have done? Probably would have had him beheaded, just like John the Baptist. Isn't it fascinating when you really think about why things occurred the way they occurred? When I read the scriptures and when I read the Bible, sometimes I have to look at it and I say, wow, that's really interesting. Because if you don't really dig deep enough, you'd say, well, why wouldn't Jesus say that? But understanding the whole of the story and who each of these characters are and who history, not only the Bible, but who history says they are, is key to understanding how these things played out. Why do I really want to emphasize that this really occurred, that this really happened? Because in the world today, it's so easy for many people to say, well, it didn't just really happen like that. That's only what the Bible says. No. Again, you can go to different Mid-Eastern, different historians. So many different people wrote about Jesus, wrote about this time, wrote about these individuals, Pontius Pilate, Herod, Caiaphas, Annas, so many different people. So it happened as close to what these videos are showing you, very close to the way it probably did happen. Jesus said nothing to Herod because he had to go before Pontius Pilate. Now, one thing the key about, really understand about Pilate, and that we should understand even about the cross and crucifixion, is that that wasn't special for Jesus. He wasn't the first person to be crucified by far. In fact, that was a known terror thing that the Romans did. Whenever they would conquer some land or some area, what they would do is take a huge swath of men of fighting age, and they, whatever the main road leading to that city or that area was, they would line it with crosses and people being crucified. As a warning, don't mess with Rome. This is not something that you want to do. Jesus obviously knows this, and he knows that he has to go to the cross because it was foretold in the Old Testament that the Messiah would be hung on a tree. Not beheaded by Herod, but hung on a tree. So everything that was foretold, everything was prophesied, Jesus is actually bringing to fruition. Now this last clip is going to bring us home to an extent. It's the judgment of Jesus. It's the point in which Pontius Pilate really has to fulfill what the prophecy laid out, and recognizing, again, that Jesus had to go there. He has some very influential and very choice, I guess, teaching for Pilate at this time. So let's play that. That's a very impactful visual image of what had happened to Jesus. It's so hard sometimes to visualize it when you just read it through the scriptures, when you just read the words that he received such a brutal beating, but to see it kind of portrayed there. And I spared us the 10 minutes of that beating in the video because as I watched it again, I was thinking, this is horrible. But it really happened. If that was not exactly, it was very close to what Jesus was subject to. Why did he go on trial? Is it because he was a threat to the religious leaders of that time? Yes. Did he go on trial because he claimed to be the Son of God, the Messiah? Yes. But more importantly, he went on trial for each and every one of us. The specific things that happened during this time to Jesus was understood before we were even born. It was pre-planned. He knew everything that was going to happen, but decided to go through it anyway because he had to adhere to what the prophets had already said would happen. He did that for each and every one of us. Sometimes it's hard for us to really recognize it. It's hard for me. And I've read through the scriptures and I read it over and again, and it's a source of inspiration for me. But to understand and to clearly see, this happened. It's not just a story. It's not a fairy tale. And it's for me. It's for each and every one of us. It's impactful. We took a different route today to have a little less traditional type of a church service. Instead of more an understanding of the history that is relevant, to know who the players are, to know that this did not happen haphazardly. It was strategic. It didn't happen because Jesus couldn't run away from what happened, or it couldn't happen because he couldn't have gotten out of it. No, it happened because he pressed forward into that situation, into the pain, into the suffering for each and every one of us, so that we would have the opportunity to have eternal life. Now, knowing that, for those of us here today who would say, yes, I believe in Jesus. My parents or my grandparents taught me about Jesus. Yes, I believe that he's the Son of God. I would ask you a question. If you were to be put on trial today, would there be enough evidence to convict you of being a Christian? If you were put on trial today, based on what people see in your life, see what you do, what you say, how you act, would there be enough evidence to convict you of being a Christian? Jesus gave them more than enough evidence to send him to the cross for each and every one of us. I think the least we could do is live a life that people would see in us the evidence, the love, the forgiveness, the peace, the kindness, the service, the selflessness that Jesus asked for us. That people would see that in us enough that they say, yeah, I know Brandon. I've seen him. I've seen what he's done. He's definitely guilty.